What we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to talk about the global agricultural landscape. And in some respects, we're going to look at feeding more than 9 billion people. To begin with, what I have here is a cartogram that basically looks at the population from 1950 to 2020. Essentially, what this does is provides a equal population density and then just changes that from time to time. In terms of, if you look at that, certainly you see that the U.S. is shrinking. Certainly you see that Africa and Asia are increasing during the size of this cartogram. And so essentially in most of your parents' lifetime, this is the world they were facing, where from a population perspective, the U.S. was growing, but it wasn't growing as fast as other parts of the region. Certainly we saw a lot of growth in India, we saw a lot of growth in Asia, we saw a lot of growth in Africa, and in some respects we saw some shrinkage in Europe, a little bit of shrinkage in the Australia and New Zealand regions. If we look at where we are in this lifetime, that your working lifetime will be, essentially we're going to continue to see Africa explode in terms of population. Certainly we see some growth in the Asia region, but in some respects compared to Africa, it isn't near as fast. We continue to see a little bit of relative shrinkage in North America and some shrinkage in South America, and we begin to continue to see that shrinkage in Europe. If we look at the projections, and again, it's always a little bit dangerous to look at projections, but from 2050 to 2010, for many of you, this will be the generation that your kids live in. Probably the big thing there is just the expansion of Africa. Again, you see that from a relative scale, even Asia begins to become less dominant relatively. And so Africa is really going to be the predominant aspect as we move forward. And so that gives a little bit of a picture with regards to where the global population is going to go. First, I think it's important just to realize where we are from a global food security perspective at this point. This graph is the World Food Program hunger map from 2019. Again, basically, if you look at blue, that indicates that less than 2.5% of the people are certainly in a state of hunger. You go to the light green, for example, Argentina is in the light green there, you will see less than 5%. If we move to yellow, essentially here's where you end up seeing a situation where India, China are, where 5 to 14 or 15% of the people are in a state of hunger. We move into the orange, where we have, for example, Sudan and Ethiopia. That's a range of 15 to 25% are hungry. And again, then we move into the light red. Essentially here you have countries such as Angola and Namibia. And then we can move into the dark red, and kind of taking a look at the dark red, we have countries such as Zambia and Malawi, where more than 35% of the people are hungry. A couple countries where we don't have data for, we don't have data on South Sudan, we don't have data for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and so there are regions where we do not have data, and so the gray areas would be that. But in some respects, if we really look at it, and probably what's most disconcerting, especially combining with the previous graphs there, is the whole aspect of Africa. Africa is going to see huge growth. But if you look at where they are from now, they're kind of starting from a situation behind. And so they're expected to see huge growth, and we're going to put a lot more people on the planet in areas where hunger is already an issue. And so one of the things we're going to take a look at here is we're just going to try to understand where we are from a global demand and a global supply perspective. And are we going to have that ability for demand to meet supply? There's really two things that affect global demand. The first is population, and we've given you a little bit of a preview of population, but we're going to look at that from some number perspective. And then we're going to look at income. And so those are the two aspects that we're associated with. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at land resources. And so where are we from a land resource perspective? And then productivity. And so there's two things that essentially provide food. Certainly one is land, and then the other one is how well we use that land. And so by providing that information, certainly I think it will be helpful to begin to understand just where we are and do we have that potential to equilibrate demand and supply such that we do have the food resources necessary to move forward. One of the things, and again, this just looks at it from a graphical perspective. It looks at the global population. You can see in 1950, we were about 2.6 billion people. In terms of looking at that, basically, essentially, by 1960, we're about 3 billion people. And then if you look at how quickly we added that, by about 1975, roughly 15 years, we moved to 4 billion. Basically, by 1986, 1987, about 12 years, we hit the 5 billion. In terms of where we are, essentially, about 1997, 1998, we hit the 6 billion. In terms of 7 billion, essentially, we hit about 2012. One of the things that you see here, and it's not easy to see, but you do see an inflection point. And what that inflection point means is we went from a region where we're increasing at an increasing rate to now we're increasing at a decreasing rate. And so in some respects, certainly that's a little bit of a positive view with regards to the fact that we're beginning to slow down that global population growth. It is still increasing, but it is beginning to increase at a slower rate each year. It's really important to consider this in a regional basis, however, in terms of, and so if we look at this, we have Africa, and so essentially if we look at this blue line here, we can see where Africa is, and of all the countries or all the regions of the world, basically that's the only country that's still increasing at an increasing rate. All the other countries are having population increase at a decreasing rate. In terms of the red line here is Asia, and so it's certainly important to look at that. One of the things you can end up seeing is if you get out here to 2050, it begins to look like we may end up hitting a maximum or at least leveling off from a maximum population growth. And then you look at the other countries, you look at Europe, Latin America, North America, Oceania. Certainly there is some growth in there, but in fact each of those regions of the world have less than 1 billion in terms of the population. If you look at where we are now in 2020, and excuse my line there, essentially you're looking at about 1.5 billion people in Africa. You're looking at about 4.6 billion people in Asia. And so kind of looking at this a little bit and providing some view here is we also want to break down Asia a little bit just to provide a look at that. And so again, looking at this, you can kind of see the western region of Asia, the south central region of Asia, the southeastern region of Asia, and then the eastern region of Asia. And so this gives a little bit of a picture of where we are. And the reason we're breaking down Asia, simply it is so dominant with regards to the population. And so by looking at this, one of the things you can end up seeing is that all of Asia is growing. In terms of, we have Western Asia growing essentially from 2020 forward. In terms of a little bit of growth there, also Southeastern Asia. But Western Asia and Southeastern Asia, both of those will be less than a million or a billion people. Certainly Southeastern Asia and then Western Asia will be less than 500 million people by 2050. If you look at the blue line here, this is Eastern Asia. One of the things you end up seeing is that Eastern Asia, probably within the 10 years or so, will begin to actually peak their population and will begin to see a little bit of a decline. And again, these are UN population growth numbers. We use the median variant here. If you look at South Central Asia, though, we see a lot of growth. And so essentially we're expected to roughly add another 500 million people in South Central Asia. Again, many of those in India. And then looking at this, certainly you can see that from an Asian perspective, back about 2000, 2001, essentially South Central Asia increased or surpassed the population in Eastern Asia. I also put in the dotted lines for China and India, and they kind of cover where we are from those major countries within those, and the blue of China represents that it's in Eastern Asia, the red of India. One of the things to look at that is China currently is the most populous country. However, if you look at this, there basically is expected to have an intersection there in about 2027 where, according to the projections, India is expected to surpass China. The other thing I think it's important to realize is by the time we get to 2050, India probably will have about 200 to 300 million more people than China. And so one of the things I think that may occur in your working lifetime is certainly the fact that India could end up being more important with regards to population. And we'll see that when we get to the supply perspective. But if you think back to the hunger map, in some respects, both of those are kind of in the gold region, and that gold region indicates that there is population hunger of between 5 and 15%. And so it'll be interesting to see how well both China and India are able to deal with those shortages in food availability already, how that might change as we move forward. My thoughts on that is that it's more likely that China may end up being in a relatively better position. They may end up seeing a decrease in hunger, where India certainly has the potential to go the other way. And so looking at this over the next 20 years, essentially, or next 30 years, essentially global population will increase from 7.8 to 9.7%. Roughly, this is a 25% increase. I like thinking about basically, if we look at what's going to go on in the world, it's all going to be in Asia, in Africa. Essentially, if we add those two together, of that 1.9 increase, essentially Asia is going to increase from 4.6 to 5.3, so that's a 0.7% increase. And in Africa, basically, is going to see a 1.2 increase. And so, again, if you add those two together, and it's not perfect math, but essentially all the people that are being added to the Earth's population essentially are going to be in Asia or Africa. In Asia, that's a 14% increase. In Africa, basically, it's an 86% increase. Looking at this, India will overtake China as the most populated country by about 2027. That's the projections with regards to that. And those two countries constitute roughly 36% of the world's population. And so above 33%, above 1/3, almost 2/5 of the world's population are just in those two countries. The other thing I think it's important to realize is that if we look at the growth in high-income countries, essentially it's pretty small in terms of it's about 60 million people, a growth of 4.8%. We end up seeing that in middle-income countries, we'll see an increase of about 1.1 billion, and so that's 20.5%. And then if we look at low-income countries, essentially that's a 700 million increase there. And again, if you're looking at this, it's probably not where you would want to place a lot of people, but essentially the growth rate of population in low-income countries is expected to be about 90% over the 30-year period, about 3% a year. In terms of growth, in the middle-income countries will end up being 21% roughly about 2/3% per year. And then the growth in the high-income countries is less than 5%. And so certainly I think the big concern here is just where the people are going to come in. And they're going to be, the projections are that they will be in those low-income countries. That again is going to stretch the situation where many of those countries already are struggling from a food security perspective. That gives a little bit of a population perspective. The other aspect there is income. I could ask each one of you how many have the same diet that they had in college. How many of those expect to have the same diet 20 years from now? In some respects, for those that are in college or recently out of college, certainly food consumption is based on price. That is, we'll eat as cheaply as we can. Most individuals, though, kind of plan that once they obtain a little bit more wealth, they're going to diversify their diet. And they're willing to pay a little bit more to get higher quality items. And this is one of the things that not only occurs in the U.S., but it occurs globally. The fact that as people have more income, they diversify their diet. A lot of times they'll add more protein. Many times that will come from the animal industry. Other times, for example, they just end up diversifying into the types of product. For example, in some respects, if you live in a tropical region and you have fruit for morning, noon, and evening, even fruit in those cases probably gets a little bit overbearing. And so in some respects, as they get more income, will diversify their diet into maybe starches, maybe proteins. With regards to the U.S., a lot of times, depending on where you are in the country, you will add more fruits and vegetables and eliminate some of the grain-based products. And the key thing, though, is that certainly income matters. In terms of where we are from an income perspective, I've taken some OEC numbers, and these are projections. But in terms of looking at that, by 2050, essentially the per capita GDP is expected to be $80,000. In the U.S. and Australia, probably looking at 74,000. And then if you look at France, probably looking at this 55,000. A couple countries I think that are important to look at is certainly South Africa. There seems to be a fairly high expectation of growth in South Africa. The other place is China. In terms of those, basically are going to be expected to be over 30,000. Right now they're both kind of in that 10,000 area, and so in some respects it's almost a tripling over the next 30 years of their per capita GDP. If we look at Brazil, certainly there's some growth there, and then also there's some growth in India. If we look at that, that looks like a pretty smooth type thing. And if you kind of go back and look at 2020, I think it's important to think about whether or not you expect that relative variability that we see before 2020. Does that occur after 2020? In some respects, it's almost a secret of any projections, and I think it's important to realize that this is any projections, whether or not it be climate, whether or not it be pandemics, whether or not it be income. Basically, once you get very many years out of forecasting, all it ends up doing is revert to the mean trend. And so in some respects, that's where sometimes you can get pretty explosive models just by picking on where your starting point is and what that trend looks like at that point of the year. But in some respects, don't expect smoothness. I think you're going to see a lot of variability in that per capita GDP per year as we move forward. And so in some respects, I think this is very misleading to kind of look at it pre and post and think all of a sudden we've taken the risk out of the system. We haven't taken the risk out of the system. That risk will be there. And so certainly there's going to be individuals that are going to have to figure out how to manage food supply in a situation where income is very variable. If we look at this, certainly global per capita income is going to grow dramatically over the next 30 years. We saw that 2 graphs ago. If we look at the OECD projections, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, basically projects are expected to essentially 1.8% per year in Australia, 2.17% in Brazil, 3.3 in China, 1.6 in France, 4.4 in India, 3.06 in South Africa, 1.44 in the U.S. I think one of the things to realize, if you look at this chart here, where are the 2 highest growth areas? They're in India and China. And so in some respects where we're having high growth, essentially 36% of the world's population sits in those areas. And so because of that, I think we're going to see major shifts of what's going on in China and what's going on in India. And so as you work through your careers, we're seeing or expected to see countries that have very high populations also have very high income growth. And so with that, we're likely to see very strong shifts in diet. The last thing we're going to look at before we maybe move forward is the whole issue of global connectedness. What I've done is I've taken the equity markets return from the US, Germany, Japan, Hong Kong, France, Australia, Brazil, India, and Argentina. And basically what I ended up doing is tracking how they performed since December 1st, 2019. And the idea here is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic, has that kind of, as that moved across the world and across the globe, how closely did these equity markets move? Again, if you look at pretty much everything on a daily basis, from essentially December 1 till essentially March 1, they pretty much moved in lockstep. The only one that was a little bit different was Argentina. I'm not sure what was going on in Argentina with regards to an anomaly, but in some respects they were pretty stable across the globe for a roughly a 3-month period from December 1 to March 1. After March 1, one of the things you'll end up seeing is that they all went down very quickly with regards to the COVID-19 and all the discussion with regards to that. And so roughly in a 20-day period, we went from a situation where equity markets were at about 100% of their value from December 1 to the fact where we've lost anywhere from roughly about 14-15% to 40% of the market value by the time we hit the bottom. Again, these graphs only go through roughly the 26th of March, and so you can see that some of them bounced off. It will be interesting to see just how those graphs have continued to move. But the key thing is the virus did not spread around equally across the globe. In some respects, it started kind of in that Hong Kong region, and in some respects, they've actually seen a lower decline than some of the others. If you look at kind of where we are from a U.S. perspective, where we are from a French perspective, a Japanese perspective, went down, and Brazil in some respects has seen a bigger reaction than the others. The key thing here is it's really important to realize that what happens in one area of the region can really end up moving the markets. And so whether or not that be in corn, whether or not that be in soybeans, whether or not that be in cattle, whether or not that be in equity markets, certainly that is important aspects with regards to thinking through the future. So with that, one of the things I think to think about is certainly that population and income is going to equal increased food demand in the future. Again, this study is being a little bit dated. I'd love to see this updated, but at this point it isn't. But certainly the demand for cereals and food and animal feed is projected to increase from 2.1 to 3 billion tons by 2050. The demand for meat projection is projected to increase from 200 to 470 million tons. And so here we're basically seeing more than a doubling of the needs. This certainly is going to create opportunities for agribusiness. And so for those of you that are wanting to move into the food and agribusiness sector, there's certainly going to be opportunities as we move forward. With that, I think we'll break here. We'll come back and look at the supply side. So far, we've looked at the demand side, and as we come back, we can take a look at the supply side. So we will catch you on the other side when we look at supply.